Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had a trilateral dialogue with his South Korean and Japanese counterparts, discussing how the three countries will be aligned on the North Korean issues. And the Biden administration said its review of North Korean policy is coming to a conclusion, adding that denuclearization of North Korea will be at the center of the policy. Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Joseph Detrani. Ambassador Detrani was former special envoy for the six-party talks. He was also director of National Counterproliferation Center. Bruce Klingner is also with us. Mr. Klingner is Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center. He formerly served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
First of all, Ambassador, how do you perceive the significance of the trilateral meeting of the National Security Advisors?
No, I think it was an excellent meeting. I mean, from all indications, a very necessary meeting. We need to work closely with our allies in South Korea and Japan. So I think this was it's an important message that the United States certainly is working closely with our two allies, principal allies, working on the North Korea issue. We want to be totally in sync. So I think it was well done, and I think it was a smart move.
All right. Mr. Klingner, how important was it to hold this meeting at this point?
It's a follow-on to the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State's visits with their counterparts. So now this is the third lane in the road. So it shows that the Biden administration treasures our allies and that we are engaging them during the process of developing the Biden administration's policy on North Korea. So I think it sends very good signals that we value the allies, that we are incorporating their views, and also hopefully it shows the importance of trilateralism. You know, given the difficult relations between Seoul and Tokyo recently, this hopefully is a way of urging all three nations to work together to address the common threats that all of us face today.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, what do you think the U.S. aimed to get out of this meeting, especially when its review of the North Korean policy was already in the final stage?
Well, we want to brief our allies on the thoughts of what the policy will be, as well as to incorporate any suggestions they have and perhaps tweak the policy before it's released. We're also trying to have a common policy. I think Washington and Tokyo seem to be the most in line on the policy. Seoul seems to be a bit of an outlier. President Moon wants to have a more engagement focused, more peace declaration focused than it appears that Washington and Tokyo want. So, you know, it's good to hash out any differences behind the scenes and then show a common front when it's released publicly.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, your thoughts on this?
I think the message that we're talking about, complete verifiable denuclearization, needs to be repeated often. That we are looking towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but of course, South Korea has no nuclear weapons, so we're talking about North Korea, and we need to be totally in sync. And we may have different views on how we proceed with certain things, but the core issue is complete verifiable denuclearization. I don't think anyone wants to be further patient for another 26 years. I think we want to get to it because as we speak and as we show some patience, if that's the word, North Korea continues to build their nuclear arsenal and their missile delivery system. So it's making the peninsula that much more insecure and the region insecure, unstable. So we really have to hit the ground running this time and try to finally resolve the issue.
Mr. Klingner, just before this trilateral meeting, the State Department said the Biden administration's North Korean policy will be centered on denuclearization. Why do you think it needed to be emphasized again?
Right now, there's a debate amongst Korea watchers, I think both inside and outside of government, sort of between denuclearization as an end point or end goal or arms control, a more limited objective where we give up on denuclearization and just try to cap the problem. And perhaps the Biden administration is trying to signal that it's going for the former. Now, the difference between the two groups, some of it I think is semantic, some of it is misperception or mischaracterization of some of the positions. A lot of folks are saying we need to try something new. Well, there's really nothing new under the sun when it comes to North Korea. All of the arms control proposals, they've actually been tried before over the decades. And also people are depicting denuclearization as we give up nothing before North Korea abandons its entire program, and that's not the case. It would be incremental process toward denuclearization. But I think by affirming the denuclearization goal, which is what's required under 11 UN resolutions, I think that's a strong message that needed to be sent.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, North Korea has returned to the provocation as if it is testing the U.S. intentions. And it even started its typical bellicose rhetoric. How do you think the national security advisors discussed these issues?
Well, it's not unusual what North Korea did. I mean, this is part of their playbook, right? When they're not happy, they threaten. They threaten to escalate. They try to intimidate. And eventually they follow through. When they say they're going to escalate, they do escalate. I think they talked about what does escalation look like? How do we stop it? How do we get North Korea to come to the table and sit down about de-escalation, about freezing everything, keeping everything in place? What would be necessary to put on the table to get them to agree to such a proposal? I think the time is important right now, and I don't think we have the luxury of just, and I think having this meeting shows we do not have the luxury of just hoping that eventually we'll find the resolution and the policy we've been pursuing for years will eventually succeed. No, it hasn't succeeded and it will not unless we are, to be candid, a little more creative and a little more proactive in addressing the issues.
Mm-hmm. And as Mr. Klingner said earlier, there are many skeptics saying North Korea will never give up their nuclear ambitions, and probably the U.S. needs a new approach towards North Korea. And meanwhile, South Korea's Moon administration once again brought up the issue of declaring the end of the Korean War. Ambassador, do you think Korea is trying to find something new approach here?
Well, I think we should keep looking for a new approach, but I think the key approach is and I think Mr. Klingner mentioned that a few minutes ago. It's actions for actions that and we saw this in Hanoi, in the Hanoi summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, that to ask for a Libyan model, to ask North Korea to immediately denuclearize, dismantle all their weapons and weapons facilities, and then we'll talk about lifting sanctions and maybe moving towards a peace treaty, etc. That's not going to happen. It's got to be actions for actions, commitments for commitments. We know that. We have to be flexible when we approach that. And so, yeah, I think some sort of a declaration indicating that we're prepared to eventually move towards a peace treaty to end the Korean War. Come on, it's been since 1953. I don't see anything wrong with that. If that could build some confidence with North Korea, because right now there's very little trust with North Korea, I think that would be a positive step.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, what is your thought on South Korea keep calling for the end of the Korean War?
Well, here I may disagree with Ambassador Detrani. When I've talked to South Korean officials as to, okay, what would be the benefits of a peace declaration, they can't point to any. There's no indication of what formal quid pro quo North Korea would do in return for a peace declaration. And it tends to be well, we think they would act better. Well, how would they act better? Well, they don't know. So, there's no, identifiable difference or benefit that signing such a declaration would be. And as South Korean officials try to convince us to do it, is say, look, it's meaningless. It's just a political document. It would have no effect. Why not sign it? Well, for that very reason, it would have no effect. I think what we need to do is work towards a more comprehensive peace treaty, as we were in one of the 5 working groups in the 6-party talks, towards a formal treaty. But that would require sort of capping or identifying the conventional threat that North Korea poses to South Korea beyond the nuclear and missile threat. So things like we did, and I was a member of the negotiating delegation for the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, where we have transparency measures. We try to thin out the conventional force along the forward edge of the battlefield area. So we need to identify and deal with the North Korean conventional threat before we sign a peace declaration or a peace treaty, because otherwise it could lead to pressure to remove U.S. forces, to end the alliance, to end the extended deterrence guarantee. If the idea of, well, the war is over, why are there still American troops here? But until we deal with that North Korean conventional force threat, we have to be very careful about signing documents.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, your thoughts on this?
When the Republic of Korea talks about maybe some other confidence-building measures, like the visits of separated families from the Korean War, or visits to Mount Kumgang, or maybe even a dialogue of what would be the conditions for reconstituting the Kaesong industrial complex. I mean, obviously, these have to be discussed, and revenue issues have to be discussed, and what percentage goes towards the nuclear missile programs. These are all issues, and that's why it's important for North Korea. I think that the basic issue here is North Korea needs to come to the negotiating table. And I applaud what the Biden administration did early in the administration in February, reaching out to North Korea, asking that they come back to negotiations, and the North Koreans have refused. So, there's only a limit to what we can do to convince them to come back. But I think what we're hearing from South Korea is if we could do things to show that we are amenable, we would be moving towards certain things. But I could tell you this, though, certain things need to be off the table. And I think Mr. Klingner mentioned a few of those things here. When we talk about the U.S. presence, military presence in South Korea, that's between South Korea and the United States. When we talk about extended nuclear deterrence, that's between the United States and South Korea and Japan. This is not an issue for North Korea. And I think we should, if we eventually, and hopefully we will, sit down with North Korea, we should tell them, look, this stuff is off the table. I can tell you this, in the six-party process, we told them it was off the table, and they never pushed back.
Ambassador Detrani brought up a lot of other very good points. We have to have North Korea in the negotiating room. The last time there were meetings between the U.S. and North Korea in October of 2019, the U.S. was just trying to get North Korea to, what do you mean by security guarantee? North Korea refused to define it. What do you mean by a peace declaration? North Korea refused. What do you mean by hostile policy? What aspects of the U.S. policy? North Korea refused to define it. So if they won't identify what their concerns are and what actions would ameliorate it, or even to go into the negotiating room, well, if you can't do anything, you can't move forward. So, that has led some people to say, well, we need to offer more benefits just to get them into the room. I think that's the wrong idea. You don't offer benefits just to talk. You don't offer benefits to someone who's violating U.S. law in U.S. banks on U.S. soil, as North Korea and China and others are doing. So we need to get them to the negotiating table. In the meantime, we maintain our military deterrence and we maintain enforcing our laws as well as UN resolutions.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong left for China for talks with his counterpart, Wang Yi. What role does China need to play now in terms of dealing with North Korea? Ambassador?
China, in principle, is amenable to complete verifiable denuclearization. There are some other issues there that would have to be pursued with China, as what does that mean afterwards? What does that mean with U.S. military presence in South Korea? What does that mean as we move towards a reunification? There are a lot of issues there, and that's between us and China. That's why that dialogue with China is so important, and it was good that we had that dialogue with our Secretary of State and National Security Advisor in Alaska a few weeks ago. So yes, I believe China should be and really has to be helpful with not only bringing North Korea to the table, but we're looking for a comprehensive, peaceful resolution to these issues here. I think China is prepared to do that. And of course, now that there's tension in the relationship with China, I think more of a dialogue with China on a lot of issues, but certainly on North Korea, needs to be on the table.
Recently, John Bolton, former National Security Advisor, said it is time for the U.S. to focus on China in order to confront North Korea, and said that Beijing must now own up to its responsibility. Do you think this is possible?
Well, I think we need bilateral dialogue with Beijing to talk about North Korea, as well as bilateral dialogue with all the other neighbors of North Korea. But at some point, we need to multilateralize the negotiations because it's not a U.S. North Korea issue. It's, as the UN resolution show, it's an international community North Korea issue. So by having just the two parties involved, it's in essence ignoring the legitimate interests of the other neighbors. And one of the reasons the Bush administration had pushed for six-party talks was because of previous complaints by South Korea that we were negotiating their security over their heads. So no matter how often U.S. diplomats engaged before and after meetings with North Korea with our allies, they still felt we were keeping something from them. So they need to be in the room at some point. On the other hand, six-party talks participants said, really the most progress is when the U.S. and North Korean negotiators left the room and dealt with issues themselves and then brought it back to the table. So there's a bit of on one side, on the other side. That said, China has repeatedly shown itself to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So there are things we can do to influence, if not the behavior of the Chinese government, the behavior of Chinese banks and businesses that are engaged in illicit activities with North Korea. Going way back to the Banco Delta Asia issue, as afterwards, the North Korean official told White House officials, you finally found a way to hurt us. And as a result of that, the Bank of China defied the government of China by cutting off its engagement with North Korea, saying they didn't want to risk being sanctioned by the U.S. as well. So if we were to actually fully enforce our laws against, the list of 12 Chinese banks that the U.S. Congress sent to the Trump White House in 2017 that were deemed to be committing money laundering crimes in the U.S. financial system, including the four largest Chinese banks, we could perhaps change their behavior to reduce their support or their turning a blind eye to North Korean money laundering and other illicit activities. It's not a silver bullet, it's a tool, but it's one tool that we should be using in conjunction with diplomacy and all the other instruments of national power.
So, Mr. Klingner, you're saying realistically, the U.S. can influence China through the secondary sanctions?
Well, what I'm saying is that even if we can't get the Chinese government to reduce turning a blind eye to violations occurring on its soil or in its waters or surrounding waters, we can go after Chinese banks and businesses that are engaged in illegal or illicit activities. So, it's if you arrest a bank robber, well, he's no longer robbing banks. And it also sends a message to others that you are now going to go after that kind of activity. And whether they were knowingly or unknowingly engaged in illicit activity, it can influence them to be weaned away from that. So what we've seen over the years with sanctions is that legitimate businesses will increase their know your customer and increase their due diligence procedures because they don't want to be sanctioned. And if they are knowingly engaged in it, they may pull away from it or they'll suffer the consequences.
Ambassador, how realistic is it to bring up the human rights issues when talking with North Korea?
It's very important. It's extremely important to talk about human rights issues. We did that in the six-party process. North Korea wants a normal relationship with the United States, but they want it on their own terms as a nuclear weapons state. We're taking nuclear weapons off the equation there. But if they want a normal relationship with the United States, assuming they're prepared to denuclearize, they need to have progress on human rights issues.
Under a progressive administration, South Korea has turned a blind eye to North Korean violations, which the UN Commission of Inquiry deemed to be so egregious and systemic that they constituted crimes against humanity unseen since Nazi Germany. Even now, they've imposed a new law which impinges on freedom of speech in South Korea at the bequest of North Korea. So, it's something that has to be part of the dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea, as well as the international community and North Korea. People will argue whether it should be part of a formal nuclear negotiation or not. Human rights activists feel that human rights has been pushed to the back burner in our quest for a denuclearization accord. So it has to be certainly part of the dialogue, if not part of the formal nuclear negotiations, certainly part of any kind of dialogue where we move forward on normal relations.
Mm-hmm. The U.S. government is soon to conclude its North Korean policy review, and foreign ministers of South Korea and China had an in-person meeting in the Chinese city of Xiamen amid renewed tensions caused by North Korea's recent missile launches. It seems like the countries have started to make their first moves towards diplomacy surrounding the Korean peninsula. Ambassador Detrani and Mr. Klingner, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.